Hi, my name is Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, if I can get through it without anyone having a pop at my shirt this time, is going to be about the now 2 legal cases against prorogation and the suggestion of a very major conflict of interest. So first of all, let's start with the one I've already been talking about. There was a case brought by various parliamentarians and QCs against the lawfulness, effectively, of Boris Johnson's prorogation, and that is being heard in the Court of Session. This was begun before he tried to prorogue Parliament. It was done in advance because he'd threatened it. So I talked about this yesterday. There was an initial hearing, and then the judge was going to, rule on whether there should be an injunction or not today. And he ruled on that, and he said not. And I said that yesterday. The government argument that there's no need to make a decision today because the case is going to be heard next week before prorogation anyway would make it, immaterial effectively. There's no need to provide an injunction right now because the full hearing later, why not just do it then? I accept that. There's no reason not to do that. And indeed, that was the judge's view. The way it was reported was a little bit weird. As one person noted out, for example, the BBC reported it as "Judge refuses to halt the prorogation." I can't remember the exact headline, but it focused on that bit. Now, remember, the judge basically said, he's not minded to issue one at this time. It's not an indication that he's not convinced by the arguments. He just specifically said he's not convinced by the arguments for needing one today. What they should have reported, however, the big piece of news was this full hearing was supposed to be for next Friday. It has been brought ahead to next Tuesday. So what the judge has actually done is said, this is actually super serious. I've listened to the arguments both sides. There's definitely a case here. We need to hear this earlier. Because if the full hearing was next Friday, you wouldn't get a decision on next Friday. It'd have to be, I don't know that they even do them at the weekend, do they? Might have to be the following Monday, when that's roundabout when they're going to prorogue. So the hearing is going to be next Tuesday. That means we might get a decision, a verdict, effectively the Wednesday. But, if it had to be the Thursday, it has to be the Thursday if the judge has to consider a lot of things. So that's the major issue there now. Let's split up the 2 different court cases with the huge conflict of interest issue. So Parliament is obviously up in arms because Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, has asked the Queen to prorogue Parliament. Obviously, she's had to do that. What happened on that day? So, that's where we were at the start of the week, on the Tuesday. What happened is there was a sharp drop in the pound, it lost 1% of its value, which doesn't sound like a lot. But, of course, you can make a lot of money out of that. Let's say that tomorrow the pound's going to drop in value. Now, we've already talked about, the issue of shorting the pound at various points in order to make a quick buck. If there's going to be an announcement that basically says, something that's so terrible, even though you've convinced the population it's not terrible, that's actually great, but it is terrible. That's why our currency devalues. This was the same thing on the Brexit referendum day, before any results had come out, before even exit polls had been released, because they couldn't. Nigel Farage was conceding defeat. He couldn't possibly know anything unless someone broke the law. Why was he doing it? To cause a drop in the pound so that his, hedge fund mates could make a killing. So let's have a think. Is there anyone at the top of government that is known for doing this sort of behaviour? Is there anyone who would be able to pass on information? By the way, tomorrow we're going to be proroguing Parliament, and, that'll cause a drop in the pound. If you want to make a quick buck, here we go. Let me think now. Oh, yeah, so how does prorogation work again? So the Prime Minister requests it, but in terms of the real mechanism, it's the Queen that does it on the advice of the Privy Council. The Privy Council is made up of senior MPs on both sides of the House, so we know that a good half of them at least would have been dead against it. It's made up of government MPs as well as senior MPs, like experienced MPs on the opposition benches, as well, including the front bench of the opposition, but it includes the back benches as well. And who is head of that Privy Council? Of course, it's the leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is known for this. He is a financier, effectively. He knows others. He's very much in on the disaster capitalism. So, yeah, massive conflict of interest. And I think only because this thing is so huge at the moment is probably the only reason no one is really poking at that at the moment. I've seen the odd mention of it. So anyway, on to the other court case. So John Major behind me here, former Prime Minister. So obviously a lot of experience here. He had always said if Boris Johnson tries to prorogue Parliament, he would initiate a judicial review into the validity of the decision. They know that they can't attack the legality of the prorogation itself, because that's just a normal system and it's done by the Queen anyway. But you can attack the validity of the advice that leads to it. Now, Gina Miller, who was the person who went to court and forced Theresa May to put it to a vote of Parliament before she could trigger Article 50, had already begun proceedings in this way. So what Sir John Major has done is basically got involved in that same court case. And Miller, of course, is very grateful to receive that because he has a lot of experience of this. In fact, more than you might imagine. Obviously, former Prime Minister, a great deal of experience in Parliament. So he can certainly attest to the way prorogation is supposed to work. And in fact, as many people I'm sure would say in the comments if I hadn't mentioned this myself, he used prorogation for political expediency himself as Prime Minister. He didn't do what's happening here. You know, he did it at a time that suited him, which didn't necessarily suit Parliament. Remember, the big difference here is that Boris Johnson is specifically using prorogation to force through a major constitutional change on the UK that is very likely to lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom against the will of Parliament, and he's doing it in such a way as to prevent Parliament from having a say on this. That, if it can be demonstrated, is there's going to be no argument about it. That advice would then be ruled invalid. Now, coming back to the earlier court case, the QC in charge of that, the one in the Court of Session in Scotland, has actually suggested that really what should happen now is that Boris Johnson should sign an affidavit with the reasons for prorogation in it. Now, I don't know that there's any legal requirement. I mean, this is the QC of the person bringing the case. It's not a judge saying that the Prime Minister has to do this. I'm guessing he's not going to do this. He has, of course, denied doing it for Brexit reasons, but you know, one cabinet minister has already admitted on camera that it is for Brexit reasons. We all know it is anyway. Absolutely, you'd have to be, I don't know how daft you'd have to be to believe otherwise. So what this other court case is for, it's not a duplicate court case. In fact, this is the reason why Sir John Major has got in on Gina Miller's, and in fact Joe Swinson on behalf of the Liberal Democrats has also got in on it as well. There's no point in having lots of them. This is a judicial review. But it is again looking at the same thing. It's looking at the legality of the advice offered to the Queen. Was it valid? You know, is it based on things that are simply not true? In which case, if you can demonstrate that the advice given is not valid, then you can actually, and this is what was discussed in the hearing yesterday, there is precedent for that advice being ruled as invalid and the Queen having to remove that order, change the order, rescind the order, whatever you want to call it. So that's the purpose of this now as well. And the other thing I will also have to say, I was talking about, you know, an impromptu protest that sort of began on Tuesday, and there's more protest plans. So there have been a number of fairly large protests taking place, and remember they've been fairly hastily arranged, and it had to be for people who wouldn't be at work today or called in or whatever. So those have been happening around the country. This is not just in London now. So it is now looking, I have to say, like whatever the master plan is of this reason to prorogue, it is looking like one of two things to me. Either something that's badly backfiring. Like what I think one person I saw it described as Dominic Cummings thinks he's pulling a masterstroke, but in actual fact he's a chicken staring down a lorry. But it may not be. It may not be simple, because we're sort of looking at this. The thing is, although we know Dominic Cummings will have persuaded Boris Johnson to do this, we keep looking at it through the lens of from Boris Johnson's point of view. And how can it possibly be helping him? There is no guarantee it is helping him. Dominic Cummings is not helping Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson may think he is. Dominic Cummings is doing his own thing. if Dominic Cummings genuinely wants a no-deal Brexit, then this prorogation is the way to go for it, and it gives them the best chance of achieving it, especially if it cannot be proved to the standard required of a court of law that the evidence wasn't invalid. And if Boris Johnson doesn't if he doesn't actually provide his evidence under oath or on an affidavit signed by him, then he can carry on lying. He can lie to the media. It's not illegal to lie to the media. It's not illegal to lie to the people. We already know that from earlier this summer. It would be illegal to be untruthful on an affidavit, and it would be unlawful to swear on oath and lie in a court of law, but he's not going to do either of those two things, I strongly suspect. So, if that never comes through, it may be that the courts just have to say, we haven't got strong enough evidence that it is being done for invalid reasons. I don't know. We will find out. But so if this goes through, then that might be the best chance of no-deal Brexit, which I don't believe does Boris Johnson any good at all. He thinks it will. He thinks the Brexit party will dissolve away, and then in the ensuing general election, he will beast it. Can't rule it out. I don't believe that would happen. I don't believe the Brexit party is going anywhere. Because apart from anything else, Nigel Farage, if we're out of the EU, he's no longer an MEP. And he's no longer got people like Aaron Banks giving him money, because why would they? Nigel Farage is surplus to requirements. What role does he have in a post-Brexit Britain? His entire purpose for the Brexit argument was to persuade people that Brexit's good. Once it's happened, he cannot fulfill that role anymore. It's not worth anyone giving him any money to do it. So he needs to be elected to Parliament. He needs some money. He's lazy. He's not going to go out and do some work for it. So he wants to get into Parliament. The idea of him not putting up any candidates, including himself, for a general election sounds to me a bit balmy. And he will absolutely play on the incompetence of Boris Johnson to achieve a good... He'll say that anything that goes wrong with Brexit will be Boris Johnson's fault, or whoever happens to be in charge at the time. And he'll play on that to try and get some seats. So I don't think they're going away. I don't think this does Boris Johnson any good. But it may serve Dominic Cummings' purpose, and he may have just persuaded Boris Johnson that it'll do some good. So it may not be that Dominic Cummings is actually, I've sort of alluded to the fact that maybe he's not as bright as we think. He may be. This may be serving his purpose, just not Boris Johnson's purpose. But anyway, that's the situation we have at the moment. So we've got a couple of court cases to look forward to. One's going to get its full hearing next Tuesday. The other one is for next Thursday. The judicial review is for next Thursday. Obviously, what we're really hoping for is that MPs do something themselves, because then we don't have to rely on the courts then. And yes, we've got that huge conflict of interest, which I hope doesn't go away in terms of investigating Jacob Rees-Mogg and any friends he may have, and how much money they may have made out of this as well, as a result of tipping them off about what the government was going to do. Because, talk about insider information. Wow. But that hopefully is where we are at the end of this week. Next week is going to be explosive. Absolutely explosive. I can guarantee that. Parliament does not sit again until the Tuesday, and it's quite late on in the Tuesday. We will have to see what happens there. Expect fireworks. But I hope you found the video interesting. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.